Hello. Today we're going to talk about The Death of Ivan Ilyich by Leo Tolstoy. As usual, I have lots of visual scenes prepared for you, so stay tuned for that and subscribe. Now, what you need to know about this short novella is that Tolstoy wrote it after going through his own existential crisis. Because he wrote The Death of Ivan Ilyich in 1886, but just 6 years before that, he wrote an autobiographical text titled A Confession. In it, he began to question his successful aristocratic life, and he wrote, "With all my soul I wished to be good, but I was young, passionate and alone, completely alone when I sought goodness. Every time I tried to express my most sincere desire, which was to be morally good, I met with contempt and ridicule. But as soon as I yielded to low passions, I was praised and encouraged. Ambition, love of power, covetousness, lasciviousness, pride, anger and revenge were all respected." Living this way for years, Tolstoy became a successful writer. He had money, fame, excellent food and women, and yet Tolstoy felt lost, unable to find the reason behind the life he had created for himself. And so he began to search for the true meaning of life, which later greatly inspired him to write The Death of Ivan Ilyich. And I'm also going to tell you where exactly Tolstoy found his meaning, but at the end of the video. Now we're going to listen to the story. Or like, you are going to listen, I am going to talk, but you know. And so we start in the building of the public courts, precisely in the office of Ivan Yegorovich, and we see here Ivan, Fyodor Vasilievich, and Pyotr Ivanovich. That's like the first time when I'm not going to struggle with the pronunciation. Even though I'm going to give you the Polish one and not the Russian, but you know, close enough, close enough. And here they kind of spend like a lunch break together, and Fyodor is arguing with Ivan over a well-known case, while Pyotr is staying out of the conversation as he's reading the newest edition of a newspaper. But then suddenly he interrupts the others to announce that Ivan Ilyich has died. The men are immediately taken out of the conversation they were just having, and they now pass the newspaper between themselves, reading the surprising news. From the short passage, we learn that it is Ilyich's wife who informs about the passing of her beloved husband, who, as it turns out, was also a member of the Court of Justice. And then we are given some more information about Ilyich. The first thing we learn is that he was a friend to all the men gathered in the office, and the second one is that he had been ill for weeks with an incurable disease. And now you may think that if the men here were Ilyich's friends, then surely they must be sad about the news. But no, because the first thing that comes to their minds is the change within the structure of their ministry. Because you see, now that Ivan is dead, his post is open for someone new to take it, and when that happens, then the whole system will shift, causing the majority of workers to move up. So now Fyodor keeps thinking about his own promotion, while Pyotr imagines improving his family life because of the opportunities that his new post will likely bring. But then, after a moment of silence, Pyotr finally speaks up, saying that he had actually suspected that Ivan wouldn't recover from his illness. And then he says that no one really knew what Ivan had, as every doctor gave him a different diagnosis. And after that, he asks if Ivan had any properties nearby. And so the men then talk a bit about the buildings in the city, and after that their lunch break ends, and so they leave the room. Following that, Tolstoy writes that the news of their colleague's death brought not only curiosity about the changes within the ministry, but also gladness that it was he who died and not them. And well, you may think that, okay, but those were just his colleagues, so not a big deal. But no, because it turns out that Fyodor and Pyotr were actually his closest friends. Which is interesting, considering that they didn't even know where he lived. Following that, we begin to follow Pyotr, who, after spending some time with his family, heads over to Ivan Ilyich's house. In a short time, he finds himself inside a corridor where he meets his other colleague, Schwarz, who's described as having a very elegant look, yet a playful spirit. Schwarz winks at Pyotr here as if saying to him, Ivan Ilyich left his affairs in a clumsy mess. You and I are a different sort. After which he begins to search for a good spot for a game of cards while Pyotr heads into the room where the body of Ilyich is said to be. Now Pyotr enters rather awkwardly, not really sure about what to do and how to behave, and so he just crosses himself and he looks around the room. And what's very interesting to me, and what you're going to see later as well, is that Pyotr seems to be overly concentrated on how he's supposed to behave and how others see him, to the point where his performance is more important to him than his experience in the world. You know what I mean? When you're more of an actor than a human, I guess. And now Pyotr notices a bunch of people who have already gathered in the room, along with the butler's assistant Gerasim, who's going to be important later. And as Pyotr looks around, he becomes aware of the smell of the decaying body, and so he heads in its direction, and soon he sees the dead body of Ivan Ilyich. But the sight doesn't bring much emotion to him, as we get a rather nonchalant description that reads, "The dead man was lying, as dead men always lie, especially heavily, his deadened limbs forever sinking into the cushions, his head forever bowing on the pillow, and he was on display as dead men are always put on display, with his waxen yellow forehead speckled with bald spots and his nose sticking up as though pressing into his upper lip." But then, as Pyotr stares longer at the body, he notices that Ivan's face actually changed a bit, because now it was thinner and more distinguished, with a look that seemed to have a warning to the living. And upon seeing this, Pyotr grows rather uncomfortable, and so he crosses himself one more time and then gets out of the room. And now as he comes out, he notices Schwarz already waiting for him, which eases his mind a bit, as his colleague gives us this feeling of being above this whole situation, the only thing on his mind being the game of cards that he committed himself to play. And so Schwarz whispers to Pyotr, asking to meet up for a game, but before Pyotr is able to answer, suddenly they see the widow Praskovia Fedorovna entering the scene. She says that the service will begin at once, and then upon seeing Pyotr, she comes up to him and takes his hands in hers. She then tells him that she knows that he was a true friend to her husband, and after that we get a description that once again reminds us that Pyotr is not really living, he's rather playing his role in the play called Life. Because it reads, "Pyotr Ivanovich knew that just as he had needed to cross himself earlier, here he needed to press her hand and breathe wholly and say, 'Believe it.' And so he did exactly that, receiving exactly the response he desired. He was touched and she was touched." Haltingly. Okay, you know what? The pronunciation doesn't have to be perfect all the time, I think. Yeah, you're going to forgive me that. Will you? After that, they leave the corridor and they find themselves in a drawing room, and here they sit down, and soon after Fedorovna begins to weep. And so they sit like this for a while. They are both pretty miserable, and after some time Fedorovna says that she's handling everything related to her husband's funeral, as she believes that it's better to have your mind occupied with practical matters. But then Fedorovna says that she actually has something specific to discuss. But she first reveals that in his last days, Ivan suffered terribly. He was crying out loud for the last hours of his life, shouting in anguish so loudly that he was heard all over the house. Pyotr is quite surprised by this, and so he asks if Ivan was even aware of his surroundings. And Fedorovna answers that yes, he definitely was, as he even said goodbye to everyone just a couple of minutes before his death. Now, after hearing all of this, Pyotr suddenly feels an overwhelming horror filling his body as he becomes afraid for himself. And he then thinks, 3 days of horrible suffering followed by death. That could happen to me at any moment. But then he quickly calms himself down, as he thinks that no, this could not happen to him. This happened to Ivan, not to him. And so then he starts asking about Ivan's death in detail, just as if death was something that only concerned Ilyich and not anyone else. And Fedorovna gives him the details, but then shortly after she figures that it's time to get to the point. And so she first cries for a moment, and then she calms herself down, and then she gets to the real reason reason for which she wanted to talk with Pyotr. And that, of course, is money. And so in the beginning, she kind of starts to shyly ask about her pension, but Pyotr quickly figures that she knows so much more than he does about how to get as much money as possible from Ivan's death. And so it turns out that what she really wanted to know is if she can get even more. And at first Pyotr tries to think of something, but he's not really able to. And so he says that there is nothing that he can do. And after that she sighs and she makes it very clear with her demeanor that she wants to get rid of him. He obviously notices that, and so he stands up, he says goodbye to her, and he leaves the room. After that, everyone gathers around the body of Ivan one more time, and the funeral begins, full of tears, laments, and candles. And we learn that Pyotr doesn't even look at the body, nor does he give in into any negative thoughts, and on top of that, he's the first one to leave after the funeral ends. And now we are going to get into the details of Ilych's life in a moment, but I want to touch upon the character of Pyotr. Because in his character, we can clearly see a man who lives his life only doing what he's supposed to be doing, imitating people he finds admirable, and also being very careful not to feel any negative emotions at any time. And the last point about the avoidance of negative emotions, I find it to be so interesting in his character, because you can clearly see it not even at the end when he escapes the funeral as fast as possible, but I would say that actually every action that he does connects to the avoidance of negative emotions. Because let's also look at the situation when Pyotr was about to enter the room with the body, and he was so concerned with only doing what he was supposed to be doing. And why was that exactly? What would possibly happen if he made a mistake there? I think that what would happen is that he would feel embarrassed. And I think that embarrassment is one of the hardest emotions for people to deal with, I think, maybe. Like when you really think about this, when you look at it, people are so embarrassed to do stuff, you know, that's kind of like out of the script or something, or just in general, there's a lot of embarrassment, like fear of embarrassment. And I think that Pyotr is a great example for that, because I think that you can even say that he is not really living his life, he is not experiencing his life, he is rather walking through life as if walking on a minefield, filled with mines that upon triggered explode into emotions that he's not able to deal with. And now what can we learn from that? I think that we can learn that the ability to just sit with your emotions and just feel them, experience them, and know that, you know, you feeling a negative emotion doesn't mean that the world is ending, you know. I think that the ability to do that is probably one of the most important things, most important skills that you can have in this life, because then you start to be less afraid of actually living and experiencing stuff, and you start to kind of like figure life for yourself instead of just, you know, being pressured into doing life how you're supposed to be doing life. And I think it's great, and I actually think that it's biblical. But listen, the topic is kind of complicated, but I think that it's so much, there's such a big difference between conforming to what the society around you wants you to be, and actually conforming more into what God wants you to be. You know, so I think that even if you're Christian, I think that still you should kind of like at least a little bit detach yourself from what people around you are going to say, and just concentrate your mind on God and what God wants you to be and to do. And so I think that it is biblical, because when you look at Jesus, for example, then he was making people mad all the time. Like, people did not have like a great opinion about him, or like, you know, most, or actually, is it most? I don't know the statistics, so I cannot tell you that. But okay, Why do I have to be so detailed? You know what? This is so annoying to have my mind, because it's like I'm trying to say something and my mind is just like, no. So yeah, I think that this conclusion is kind of biblical, that you should maybe not really concentrate on what people are going to say or how they're going to react. Like, if you are a Christian, then the most important thing is if God is happy with what you're doing. And if that makes people mad around you, then that's it's okay. Happens, you know? Maybe you're going to feel bad because of that for some time, but at the end of the day, this is just an emotion that's going to pass anyway. So I think that it's more important to make God happy than your human nervous system or something. I don't know. Okay, I talk too much. So yeah, the point is that I think that the character of Pyotr really shows you that you should not escape from your negative emotions so much, because the negative emotions are going to happen, whether you like it or not. Like, you're going to feel bad in your life. This is just the reality of things. And when you get used to that, it kind of gets like, I don't know, kind of peaceful in a sense. But in order to get used to them, you have to actually experience them and like not constantly run from them, from feeling them. Yeah, that's my conclusion. But like, you know, at the end of the day, I just want to preface that this is kind of getting into the field of psychology, which I am not a specialist on. So I'm just talking from my own experience, and I don't know if that's like really true or something. So, you know, so just take it with a grain of salt, which I'm trying to say. Yeah, take it with a grain of salt. And now going back to the story, we learn that in its details, the life of Ivan Ilyich was the most simple and the most ordinary and the most terrible. Ivan Ilyich died at the age of 45, and he was a son of an official in Petersburg named Ilyich Yefimovich Golovin. And Ilya had 3 sons. The eldest one followed in his footsteps, and he pursued the same career as an official, but the youngest one was a failure who made a wreck of himself and eventually ended up working on a railway. And Ivan was of course the middle child, and he is described to be the golden child of the family. And he was perfectly in the middle, not as serious as his older brother, but also not as uncivilized as his younger one. Ivan was smart, lively, nice, and proper. And it's said that in school he was already just as he would be for the rest of his life. A person of talent, cheerfully kind-hearted and sociable, but strict in fulfilling what he reckoned his duty to be. And he reckoned his duty to be whatever his superiors told him it was. And we learned that from the young age, Ivan had been drawn to the people from the upper spheres of society, maintaining friendships with them and also adopting their view of life. But it's not like he was never a rebel. He did in fact have his moments of lust and vanity, but he was protected by a strong inborn sense of moderation. And interestingly, it's also said that when he was in law school, he did some things that left him disgusted with himself. But later he noticed that the people of the higher spheres did the same things and they considered them normal. And so because of that, he too forgot about all the wrong he had done. After finishing law school, his father managed to get him a job as a special secretary to a provincial governor, and so Ivan left for the countryside. The 5 years he spent in the countryside were rather pleasant and easy. He was working, building his career, and yet he always had the time for some good fun. And he was separating his life perfectly. In official matters, he was proper and disciplined, and in society, he was playful, witty, and good-hearted. And it's safe to say that in general, everyone liked him, and he also managed to have a couple of affairs. But after those 5 years, he was informed about some new institutions that needed new people, and so Ivan took the opportunity. He got a position as an examining magistrate, and he was doing just as perfectly as in his previous job. But this position was far more interesting to him, as In his previous job, he was only able to make people feel small, but in reality, they did not have to answer to his whims. But now, this new position meant that this time, everyone, without exception, was under his thumb. He was able to order people into the roles of defendants and witnesses, tell them when to sit and when to stand up, and force them into answering his every question. But the thing is that Ivan did not want to have an image of a rigid person, and so because of that he always tried to soften his authority, because just the awareness of his power made everything more interesting. And now we learn that during those years he found himself in the finest circles of rich noblemen. He also adopted a cosmopolitan, modern liberalism and also grew a beard. His salary was high, his ability at playing cards began to develop, and in general, his life was very pleasant. But then, after 2 years in Petersburg, someone special suddenly appeared, a woman named Praskovia Fedorovna Mikiel. She was the most desirable, cleverest, and radiant woman in Ivan's circle, and so naturally, they began to spend a lot of time together. Fedorovna fell in love with him, and even though Ivan was not really thinking about marriage at the time, he decided that at the end of the day, why shouldn't he get a wife? And even though he still hoped for more, Fedorovna came from a good family and she was pretty, and so Ivan decided that she was good enough. And then we get like an interesting description, so I'm going to read it to you. Okay, wait. Okay. Thank you for waiting. Okay. To say that Ivan Ilyich got married because he'd fallen in love with someone who shared his perspectives on life would be as wrong as saying that he got married because the people of his social circle approved the union. Ivan Ilyich got married for both reasons. He did well by himself, marrying a woman like Praskovia Fedorovna, and at the same time, he did what high society found proper. So Ivan Ilyich got married. Now, in the beginning, everything was going well, as Ivan believed that marriage would not only not destroy his life, but there's also a chance that it may actually make it better. But then as Fedorovna got pregnant, everything began to change. She slowly started to shatter the pleasant atmosphere they had created by becoming jealous of him without a reason, and also demanding his attention all the time, which made her cause some ugly scenes in public. And at first Ivan tried to just ignore this whole situation with the same light-hearted yet proper attitude that had served him so well in the past. Which I kind of feel called out, to be honest. Like this whole light-hearted yet proper attitude. I have some thinking to do after this video. And so Ivan started to act as if nothing had changed. He was still inviting his friends over, or he was going to their houses. But then one day Fedorovna had enough of that, and so she started arguing with him so much that it eventually kept him at home, just as gloomy as she had become. Ivan then realized that married life wasn't as pleasant as he had thought, and so because of that he started to feel the need to separate himself from his wife, just to protect his independent world that was supposed to be pleasant. After some time, the child was finally born, but the atmosphere in the house got even worse, with Fedorovna demanding even more than before. In response to that, Ivan began to care more and more about his work, and he began to be very ambitious in it. Now, after a year, he concluded that marriage was actually complicated, and so in order to fulfill his duty, which was to live a life approved by society, he started to develop a sort of attitude towards this whole situation. He figured that he only needed a few things from marriage: home-cooked meals, intimacy, a wife to manage the house, and most importantly, the external appearance of decency as decided by public opinion. Outside of that, he decided to only focus on the pleasures of life, and so whenever he was met with his wife's bad mood, he would immediately leave for the office, where life was good. good. And a good life that was, because after 3 years he was promoted to associate public prosecutor, which made him even more important than before, and that came with even more power. But as his life at the office was improving, his home life was deteriorating. Soon a new child arrived and Fedorovna grew even angrier than before, but thanks to his attitude, Ivan was able to ignore it all. After 7 years in Petersburg, Ilyich was finally promoted to public prosecutor, and with that promotion, he and his family moved to a new city. But not long after, they began to have financial difficulties because even though Ivan had a higher salary here, at the same time, life was more expensive in this new place. And on top of that, Fedorovna began to blame Ivan for basically everything at this point, which, as you might imagine, did not exactly improve their relationship. And soon they began to feel that a great alienation had been slowly growing between them. But Ivan did not think of it as anything bad, as this was actually his goal, because the more separate he grew from his family, the more pleasant his life became. And so he did separate more and more by either not spending the time with his family or by inviting guests so that he wouldn't be left alone with them. But of course, the most important thing for Ivan was his work, because in his job he was powerful and the authority that he had put him above everyone else. And so he spent the next 7 years living just like this. During that time, some new children were born while others died, and now Ivan was left with only 2 of his children. His eldest daughter had recently turned 16 and she turned out well, having been taught at home. And when it comes to his son, Ivan wanted him to go to law school, but Fedorovna enrolled him in a high school purely out of spite. Following that, we move a bit forward and Ivan is now 17 years into his marriage. But surprisingly, life hasn't been that pleasant for him lately. He was expecting to be promoted to a better position, but suddenly his colleague managed to get it instead. And that made Ivan mad, so mad that he ended up arguing not only with the said colleague, but also with a few other people at work. As a result, they all grew distant from him, which then led to Ivan not getting the next promotion as well. And with that, we get to the year 1880, which is said to be the worst year of Ivan's life. And he had 2 reasons for that. The first one was that his salary was no longer enough to support his lifestyle, and the second one was that everyone seemed to forget about him, even though Ivan was clearly suffering. And so Ivan knew that with all the unfairness of the world, the nagging of his wife, and the debts from living beyond his means, something had to change. And so Ivan came up with a plan. In order to save some money, he took a leave of absence from work and went, together with his wife, to her brother's house in the country. There, he not only could not relax, but he was overwhelmed by a deep melancholy and also existential boredom that made him believe that going back to his previous way of life was impossible. He then spent a sleepless night pacing the terrace, and during that time he had a revelation about what his next step should be. The plan was to go to Petersburg in order to both get transferred into another ministry and also to punish his colleagues who had failed to recognize his importance. Now, Fedorovna and her brother tried to stop him from fulfilling this idea, but Ivan did not really care that much, and so soon he left for Petersburg. And the goal was very precise: get a job with a high enough salary, no matter where or on what kind of position, as long as it wasn't in his current ministry. But then as he was on the train, he met a friend who told him about some recent changes within the ministry in Petersburg, where he had previously worked. And those changes created a perfect opportunity for Ivan, as when everyone was being moved around and new positions were opening, Ivan figured that he'd be able to find a place for himself there. And so Ivan went to Petersburg, he spoke to the right person, and thanks to that he got a spot in his old ministry, 2 ranks above his former colleagues. Ivan was extremely happy, everything finally fell into place, and from this point on, everything was about to be good. Right? Ivan then went back to the country happy as can be, and he even managed to get Fedorovna into a better mood than before. They made up while Ivan told stories about how well he was received in Petersburg and how envied he was and how his enemies were now disgraced. Fedorovna was listening to everything without interruption, and she was already making plans for her new life back in Petersburg. and Ivan was overjoyed as her plans matched his own, and so they were finally on the same page, and he felt that life was about to regain all the pleasantness he had been longing for. And so it began. Ivan's new life was flourishing. He was finally getting along with his wife, and then as he was about to leave for the city, Fedorovna's family insisted on her staying longer, and so Ivan left alone. In Petersburg, he managed to find a perfect house, just as if it had been designed specially for his family. And soon after buying it, Ivan began to decorate. He chose the wallpaper, the antique furniture, and made sure that everything was developing into his own ideal for a house. And he was completely consumed by the preparation of the house, to the point where he was not even able to concentrate on anything else other than how the house was going to look like once it's finished. And not even his job was able to get his attention, as he improved and improved to the point where even one of the workers had to be corrected about how the drapes should hang. And as he was correcting the worker, he stumbled and he almost fell, but he ended up just bruising the side of his stomach. And this is going to be important later. Other than that, Ivan was perfectly joyful and healthy for this time in his life, and he even felt like he was 15 years younger than he was. And as we get a little bit more into the description of the interior, we learn that it looks exactly as one of the houses of people who are not exactly rich, but want to appear as though they are. And so because of that, we also have a fragment that reads, "And in his case, the resemblance was so strong that the house was nearly impossible to distinguish from any other, but to him, it all seemed somehow special." Now we learn that during this whole time, Ivan had been exchanging letters with his family, and on purpose, he described the place as mediocre just to surprise them even more. And after some time, the family finally arrived. As soon as they stepped into the house, they were all gasping with pleasure, and Ivan felt complete in his happiness, finding joy even in the silly fall that left him with a bruise. And after some time in the house, the sense of admiration turned into normality. And so because of that, even though the house was great, at the same time, it would have been better with one additional room. And even though Ivan's salary was high, at the same time, it could still be higher. And in the beginning, everything was still pretty exciting, as they still had some minor decorations to finish, but once that was done, life started to slowly become boring again. The routine crept in. Ivan was spending his mornings at work, then he was going back home for dinner, and in general, his mood was pretty good, but sometimes it was disrupted by some minor scratches or stains on the furniture, which was basically unacceptable to him. Other than that, his life was just as it was supposed to be, easy and full of pleasure. He enjoyed playing a character at his work, inviting guests to his house, and also reading books that were currently popular. And he especially enjoyed meeting for small dinners with people from the upper spheres. And one time during one of those parties, Ivan had a lot of fun and everything was good until his wife began a fight with him over some pastries and cakes. Because Fedorovna insisted on buying just enough food, but Ivan wanted more, and so because of that, he bought way too many pies. The bill was high, and so was the amount of pies that were left after the party. And Fedorovna was angry at him, as she even shouted at him and called him a fool and an imbecile, to which Ivan threatened divorce. But other than that, everything was nice and pleasant, as Ivan's family separated itself from their poor friends, and they only accepted the best of the best into their social circle. Soon, young men started to come to meet his daughter Lisa, and the parents began to wonder if maybe they should arrange something to marry her off well. And so the family lived, pleasant and proper. And now, following that, a new chapter in Ivan's life was about to begin. Because even though everyone seemed to be healthy, Ivan started to complain about a bad taste in his mouth and also a faint pain on the side of his stomach. But surely it couldn't be called an illness. But the discomfort did not disappear, as it later slowly turned into a constant pain, joined by a pretty bad mood. Along with his health, health, the atmosphere in the house deteriorated as well, and soon Fedorovna and Ivan were back to arguing, which turned the pleasantness of their home into a chore of maintaining a proper appearance. Soon Fedorovna came to the conclusion that Ivan's character is heavy and difficult, as this time he was the one always starting the arguments. And usually it was around the dinner time when he was intentionally finding some imperfections to fight about. Be it some scratches on the china, his son's elbows on the table, food that wasn't done right, his daughter's hairstyle, and of course, for everything, he blamed Fedorovna. Now, at first, Fedorovna was snapping back at him, but then she slowly stopped as she realized that the cause for those outbursts had to be some sort of physical pain brought on by eating. And so from this point on, Fedorovna started doing her best with just rushing everyone through the meals, while internally she started to pity herself, as she thought more and more about the fact that her husband had a difficult character, which made her life unpleasant. And after some time, she even started to wish for Ivan to die, but she was not too serious about this, as the end of Ivan's life would also mean the end of his salary. And so she just became more and more irritated, seeing herself as the most suffering one and also keeping all of her feelings inside. But then after one particular scene caused by Ivan, he finally admitted that he's been irritable for quite some time now, but it's because he's been feeling rather unwell. To this, Fedorovna told him that in that case he needs to see a doctor, and Ivan complied. And his visit at the doctor was pretty interesting because Ivan got very irritated at the doctor's pretentious self-importance, which mostly reminded him of his own attitude at Kurt. And Ivan was not really buying this still atmosphere, and so he just straight up asked, was his condition serious or not? The doctor did not answer directly, but from what he said, Ivan drew a clear conclusion, which is that things were bad. And that made Ivan feel a tremendous amount of self-pity and also anger at the doctor, who didn't seem to care as much as he should care. And now, after this visit, Ivan was coming back home in a pretty grieved mood, and he was just constantly repeating in his mind every single word that the doctor said, and he was trying to come to the conclusion whether he should worry or not. And suddenly, the whole world seemed sad to Ivan. The houses were sad, the people on the streets were sad, and also the shops seemed to be sad in his eyes. After he got home, he started telling Fedorovna about everything, and she listened, but then in the middle of his story, their daughter came into the room all ready to go out with her mother. And the daughter forced herself to sit down and listen, but after a while she became bored, and so Fedorovna had to hurry, thus not even able to hear the whole story. She then told Ivan to just remember about taking his medication, and after that she left. And so he did. He followed his doctor's orders, even though things were not turning out how they were supposed to. But Ivan was not giving up, as he now found his new meaning of life, which this time was health and sickness. And just as with every fleeting meaning that he previously had, this time he was also pretty obsessive, and he was only able to concentrate on topics that regarded either sickness or health. Now, Ivan's pain was not getting better, but despite that, he tried his best to believe that he was slowly recovering. And he almost convinced himself, but unfortunately, if even one thing went wrong, so if he had an argument with Fedorovna or maybe a bad day at work, suddenly he felt the despair creeping up again. And as a result, he cursed everyone and everything, believing that they were simply killing him, even though the thing that was killing him the most was the anger that he constantly felt. But instead of paying less attention to every single negative detail of the day, he was constantly seeking everything that enraged him, while at the same time he was also constantly repeating that he just needed peace and quiet. And on top of that, his mental health was getting worse because of all the information that he had gathered both from the medical books and also from the doctors whom he visited fairly often, even though with every visit he was confronted with the fact that his health was going downhill. In general, we can say that every doctor gave Ivan different diagnoses and prescriptions, to the point where at some point Ivan just became disillusioned by all the medications that he was supposed to take. He then fell into a deeper than ever despair, not really knowing what his next step should be, when one day he suddenly met a woman who told him about the healing powers of icons. And Ivan was definitely a bit interested in the idea, but then he quickly bashed himself for believing something so superstitious, and so he decided to just stick to the treatment from his doctor. But it was really easier said than done, as the pain on the side of his stomach kept getting worse, as well as the bad taste in his mouth. And now Ivan knew that something bad was happening, but he felt completely isolated, as only he truly understood this harsh truth. The world did not really care about his state, and everyone around, including his family, behaved as if everything was normal. And what was the worst was that his wife and his daughter became increasingly irritated by his constant gloominess, and it certainly did not help that Fedorovna began to blame Ivan for his illness, saying that he is not following his doctor's orders as strictly as he should. She started to accuse him of forgetting his drops, eating things he was not supposed to eat, and also playing cards till 1 in the morning. And so, no surprise, Ivan began to feel like he was just a problem for everyone around. And while things at home were not looking good, in court it seemed even stranger, as now suddenly his co-workers were paying a very close attention to him, but only because they were waiting for his post to be emptied. And also his friends began to tease him about his paranoia considering his health. And then one time, as he was playing cards with his friends, he noticed that just his presence alone was casting gloom on everyone around, and he felt like not only his life is poisoned, but he was now poisoning the lives of other people. And so he lived just like that, on the edge of death, with no one to understand him or feel sympathy for him. Now, after 2 months, Ivan got an unexpected guest. Because after coming back to his house, he stepped into his workroom, where he saw his brother-in-law all healthy and full of energy. But when the brother-in-law looked up to see Ivan, suddenly he just stood there in silence for a while, opening his mouth in shock. To which Ivan just sadly asked if he has changed a lot, and to this his brother-in-law quickly composed himself, answered shortly, and then didn't want to say anything more about his look. And now, soon after this encounter, they heard Fedorovna coming back to the house, and so the brother-in-law quickly excused himself in order to greet her. And after he left, he even began to check himself in the mirror. He looked at himself from every angle and even compared his reflection to a photograph that he had of himself and his wife, and the conclusion was clear: he had changed drastically. He then fell into a very dark mood, and at first he tried to kinda occupy himself, but he was not able to, and so he decided to just join the siblings. But then as he tried to get into the drawing room, he realized that the doors were locked, and so he put his ear to them and he began to listen. He heard Fedorovna saying that this is just an exaggeration, and then her brother replying that Ivan is a dead man with no light in his eyes. And then they spoke a bit about the fact that no one really knew what kind of illness Ivan had, as every doctor was giving him a different diagnosis. After that, Ivan went back to his room, he laid down, and then he started to overthink everything that he heard from the doctors up to this point. This caused him to visit yet another doctor who, of course, gave him a new diagnosis, assured him that he would recover from all of this, and told him about everything that needed to be done in order for him to get better. But Ivan was no longer optimistic, and so he just went through the rest of his day pretty detached from reality. And as evening came, he entered the guest room because he had been sleeping there alone since the beginning of his illness. And there he sat down, and at the beginning he started to imagine his health going back to normal, which got him into a pretty better mood, and so he just took his medicine, he laid down, and he started to wait for them to take the effect. And as he waited, he started to convince himself that he was actually feeling better. He just needed to take his medicine, avoid any harm, and then surely everything would go back to normal. After a while, he blew out his candle and he was getting ready to fall asleep, but then suddenly he felt the familiar pain on his side, along with the unpleasant taste in his mouth. And so even Ivan began panicking, thinking that it's not a matter of what kind of an illness he has, but a matter of life and death. And he just couldn't lie to himself anymore. The truth was that he was dying, and everyone around him was able to see it. Then Ivan began to wonder, with his heart pounding harder than ever before, where exactly he was going to go after he was no longer here. And just the thought of that filled him with terror. He kept panicking more and more, staring into the darkness, when suddenly he heard his family in another room playing the piano and laughing, which made Ivan very angry. He accused them of not feeling sorry for him, even though the same fate was waiting for them too, and then he started cursing them in his thoughts, calling them fools and animals. But after a moment he figured that he needed to calm down, and so in order to do that, he began to overthink his illness again. First, he remembered about bumping his side while fixing the drapes, and then came the doctors, the melancholy, more doctors, and finally the light had escaped from his eyes. And then Ivan reproached himself, thinking that instead of wondering about his illness, he should rather think about his death. Now, even more frightened, he reached for the matches, but he bumped into the nightstand, which made him even more angry, and so he pushed the nightstand and then he fell back onto the bed. And as he was laying there, ready to die at any second, suddenly Fedorovna came into the room. She asked if anything was wrong, to which Ivan answered that he just bumped himself, that's all. While at the same time he thought that he won't bother trying to explain anything, as she won't understand anyway. Fedorovna then asked if he's feeling worse, and he confirmed, to which she figured that maybe they should call for one of the best and most famous doctors to come to their house. But he did not agree to that, so Fedorovna just came up to him and she kissed his forehead, to which we get an interesting description that reads, "He hated her from the depths of his soul whenever she kissed him like that, and it took an effort not to shove her away." Now we move further in time and we learn that deep down in his soul, Ivan was now aware that he was dying, but it was not even that he could not accept this fact, it was more like he could not understand it. And the reason for his lack of understanding is certainly interesting, because it said that Ivan was of course aware that men were mortal, but it only seemed true in relation to other men, as Ivan was of course not just a random man. In his head he was special, as he always had something unique that separated him from others. And interestingly, it was not even anything that grand, it was just the fact that he had his own thoughts and emotions, his own memories, that made him think that it can't possibly be that he has to die. And so Ivan was not able to understand his mortality, and because of that he tried to push this idea away, explaining to himself that it was only caused by illness and it was not something true. And he was trying his best to think about anything other than death, but the terrifying thought kept coming back, no matter how hard he tried to forget about it. And he was trying his best, returning to the thoughts that previously kept him from thinking about death. And his best distraction in life was of course work, and so he tried going to the court and just pretending that everything was exactly how it was before, but then as he was trying to concentrate on work, suddenly the pain in his side kept reminding him that he should rather concentrate on death. And even tried to escape into other things as well, but no matter how hard he tried to escape the thought of death, no matter how well he tried to block it, death was able to penetrate everything and fill Ivan's mind with doom. That's my child. He has the same eyes. That's probably genetics. In his last days, Ivan was sometimes coming into the drawing room, the same one in which he had fallen when he was still furnishing the house, and one time he noticed some scratches on the table. So he started to look for the cause of them, and this is when he found an expensive album that he previously made with love, and he grew irritated as he realized that his daughter and her friends had destroyed his hard work. Some of the photographs were upside down, and Ivan also noticed that some of the pages were were torn off. And so he put everything back in order, and he thought about moving the albums somewhere else, but his wife and daughter were protesting, causing an argument that for Ivan was far more better than the constant thoughts about death. Now, in the third month of Ivan's illness, things were worse than ever before, as now everyone was aware that Ivan was dying, and frankly, everyone was actually waiting for it. His colleagues were waiting for his post to be free, his family was waiting for freedom from the eternal gloominess that his state caused, and even Ivan was waiting to be finally free from suffering. Soon his life consisted of sleepless nights, reasonable doses of opium mixed with morphine, special dishes that quickly became bland to him, and also shame from having someone else help him with using the toilet. But in all of that, he found comfort in a young peasant, Gerasim. He was always cheerful and bright, his body full of youthful energy, and his face radiating with the joy of being alive. Now, one time, when Gerasim was cleaning Ivan's toilet, Ivan began apologizing to him, saying that this job is probably not especially pleasant to Gerasim, but to this, the young man said that it's not a problem at all, as Ivan is unwell after all. And after that, Ivan began asking Gerasim for help, first with moving him to the sofa and then with keeping his legs elevated. And so first he asked for a chair to rest his legs on, then for a pillow to keep them higher, and then eventually he just asked Gerasim to keep his legs high so that he doesn't feel the pain. Gerasim fulfilled every order with ease and kindness, and so soon after that he was regularly asked by Ivan to hold his legs up and just talk with him, as Gerasim's presence was very soothing for Ivan. Now, despite all of the torments of Ivan's day-to-day life, only one specific thing was worse than anything else, and that thing was the lie. The lie that Ivan was just sick and not dying. No, he just needed to rest and receive the treatment from the doctor, and then everything would come back to normal. But Ivan knew that there was nothing that could help him at this point. There was only death and suffering ahead of him. Nevertheless, his family kept the illusion, downplaying his torment into a passing discomfort, similar that you feel when you walk into a room that has a nasty smell in it. The only person who didn't lie was Gerasim, who showed a great compassion towards Ivan, sometimes holding his legs up for the whole night and then saying that he will still have time to rest later. And then once, as he was leaving the room, he even said to Ivan that everyone has to die sooner or later, and so this is why he didn't mind helping him so much. And now, lying was not the only thing that bothered Ivan so much in his last days, as there was also the fact that no one sympathized with him as much as he wanted. And even though it was very shameful for him to admit, sometimes Ivan just wanted for someone to feel sorry for him, just as if he were an ill little boy. And we get a quite sad description here, which reads, "He wanted to be caressed, kissed, cried over as children are caressed and comforted. He knew that he was an important jurist, that he had a graying beard, and so this was impossible. All the same, it was what he wanted." And this is just so sad, because especially when I think that there's probably many people, even like to this day, who feel like this, and I don't know, I feel like comforting one another is just human. Like, it's probably one of the greatest things that we are able to do. And it's not childish to want to be comforted. Like, I don't know, and I feel like you don't even have to be sick or anything. Maybe you just had a hard day at work. Or maybe not even that. Maybe you just woke up and you were like, yeah, I want to be comforted today. And like, I don't know, for me that's like enough, to be honest. It's so weird when so many people kind of like grow up and they think that so many things that are like normal human things, they kind of start to perceive them as childish for some reason. So like comforting one another or like showing your weaknesses, because I guess this is also kind of that, maybe that's connected, because in order to be comforted, you kind of have to actually show that you're weak. You have to show your weakness. And that sometimes is quite hard for people to do, especially when you have this like idea in your mind that, you know, you are a grown-up person, a mature grown-up person, and you don't need anyone to be comforted, or like you should not even want to, because then you are not like adult enough or something. Like, I don't know. But going back to Ivan, we learned that soon his mornings were becoming all the same, with little to no hope left that anything could be better from this point. Soon he began to feel loneliness and boredom creeping in, filling him with such despair that he wished for it to come sooner. But then he quickly caught himself on this thought, and he realized that by it he means death, and so he reprimanded himself for having such thoughts. He then sat down in his armchair and he was waiting for the doctor to come in, but he was just feeling himself sinking more and more into despair. But finally the doctor arrived, fresh and full of life, which made Ivan spiral even more as he felt the professional insincerity of the said doctor. They both greeted each other, Ivan said how bad he's been feeling recently, and soon after the doctor began to examine him. And as he was in the middle of doing that, suddenly they heard Fedorovna coming in and complaining that no one has informed her about the arrival of the doctor. And as she came in, full of life, with her skin nice and smooth, her hair clean, and her eyes with a twinkle in them, Ivan began to feel deep hatred towards her. And now her attitude towards Ivan was the same as it was in the beginning of his illness, meaning that she was blaming him for everything. And so right now she started to do just that. She told the doctor that Ivan was not listening to the orders given to him, he was not taking his medication on time, and what's the worst is that he had developed a habit of laying down with his legs up, which is probably very bad for him. And to all of that, the doctor just smiled with a very condescending smile. After that, another doctor came, and this one was very famous, and after examining Ivan, he said that there's a small possibility of Ivan coming back to normal. But the excitement that Ivan felt was very short-lived, and after a couple of hours, evening came, and along with it, the old torments filled Ivan's heart once again. And then Fedorovna came into his room, all dressed up for the night, as she was heading with the kids to a theater. And Ivan felt a bit insulted by that, but then he remembered that he was actually the one insisting on buying the tickets, and so because of that he calmed down. And then Fedorovna explained herself a bit, saying that she would not decide to go if it wasn't for the fact that the tickets were already bought, and besides she couldn't let their daughter go along with her fiancé. And after saying all of that, Fedorovna asked if they could come in for a moment, and Ivan agreed. So Lisa and Fyodor Petrovich both came into the room, young and beautiful, which was very hard for Ivan to look at. And along with them, Vasya also snuck into the room with a look of pity. And Vasya was Ivan's schoolboy son, who, according to Ivan, was the only person besides Gerasim who understood the situation and felt pity for him. Now everyone sat down, and soon after an uncomfortable silence filled the entire room as Ivan was once again asked about his health. But then after a moment, Lisa began to argue with her mother about the opera glasses that got lost, and as you might imagine, the atmosphere got rather unpleasant. After that, everyone gathered began talking about the famous actress who was going to perform that night, but they all went silent as soon as they noticed that Ivan was staring straight ahead, clearly angry. For a while, there was a complete silence in the room, but then Lisa finally broke it and said that they should really get going now. And so they did. They all stood up, left the room, and went to the theater. And as Ivan was left alone, he actually felt a little bit lighter, as the illusion of him being curable disappeared along with his family. And so after that, he sent for Gerasim to come. And now in the middle of the night, Ivan heard Fedorovna coming back home, and she wanted to stay with him instead of Gerasim, but Ivan very firmly refused. And so until 3 in the morning he was trying to sleep with Gerasim holding his legs up, but he was constantly tormented in his dreams to the point of waking up. As he did, he looked around and he decided to send Gerasim off. The man tried to convince him that it's not really a problem for him to stay, but Ivan insisted, and so Gerasim left. After Ivan was left alone, he turned to his side and he began to feel sorry for himself, which quickly turned into him bawling like a child. And he had many reasons to cry. He was crying because of his solitude, his helplessness, the cruelty of man, and the cruelty of God, who seemed to be absent. He then began lamenting to God, asking him why was he torturing him? Did Ivan ever do anything to God to deserve this pain? And after he asked those questions, suddenly he became quiet, completely still, as he was trying to listen for an answer. And he actually got one through the voice of his heart, a question formed in Ivan's head, asking him what is it that he needs. And he answered that he needs to end his suffering and he needs to live. But then he kind of had a back and forth with the voice in his heart, because the voice asked him, live? Live how? And to this Ivan replied, to live, of course, how I used to, happily and well. And to this the voice asked, how you lived, happily and well. And so Ivan then began searching his memory for the best moments of his life, but strangely he could not find any. The only true happy memories that he had were from his childhood, but the one experiencing those emotions did not exist anymore, and so it was almost like imagining a stranger's life. As Ivan wondered longer, he realized that happiness started to slowly disappear from his life the longer he lived, and now it was nowhere to be seen. He then remembered the law school where everything seemed to be good. There was joy, friendship, hope, but the further he went into the school, the worse it all became. Then marriage, which of course turned into disappointment, his dying professional life, his obsession with money, and everything passed so fast, while at the same time always staying the same. And then he came to some more conclusions, which read, in perfectly measured steps I went downhill, imagining it was up. That's just how it was. In public opinion, I was on my way up, and the whole time my life was slipping away from under me. And now it's all over with and it's time to die. But then he thinks that something has to be wrong, because what then is the meaning of all of that? And so for the first time, Ivan thought that maybe his choices in life were not the best, even though he thought that he was doing everything he was supposed to be doing. But he could not accept the fact of being guilty, and so whenever something like this was coming into his head, he immediately recalled everything good in his life, causing the guilt to go away. Following that, we learned that 2 weeks passed since then, and at this point, Ivan was not getting up from the sofa at all. He just lied there with his face to the back of the sofa, and he asked himself all the existential questions over and over again, realizing even more that the only thing he can wait for now is death. His last days Ivan spent in complete loneliness, his face still to the back of the sofa and his mind occupied with the memories of the past. And the memories always began with Ivan noticing something in his daily life. So for example, if he was given prunes for the dinner, then he was starting to think about the French plums that he had in his childhood. The memories were painful for him, and he was trying his best to think about anything else, but his mind just kept tormenting him about every single detail of his past. And he saw life as a stone moving faster and faster the closer it was to the end. Ivan then kept staring at the sofa, waiting for death to come, as it was truly impossible to escape it. But the only thing he wanted now was understanding. He wanted to know what was this all for. And the thing that was bothering him the most was that everything would be explainable if he lived his life badly. But he was only able to remember all the perfect sides of his life. 2 weeks passed like this, and during that time, Fyodor, the guy who his daughter was seeing, has finally made a final proposal. And as Fedorovna wanted to give Ivan the news, she came into his room, but she found him in a state worse than ever. He was still on the sofa, but this time he was in a different position, as he was laying down on his back and he was staring straight ahead. Fedorovna started to talk about his medication, but to this, Ivan looked at her with such anger in his eyes that she went silent, to which he told her to just let him die in peace. And Fedorovna wanted to leave, but then suddenly their daughter came into the room and asked about Ivan's health. Ivan looked at her with the same anger in his eyes, and then he told her that soon he will free them from himself. And then they sat in silence a little longer, but soon after the women left. And after they did so, Lisa asked Fedorovna why is her father like this, especially considering that Lisa actually felt bad for him, but he always behaved as if everything was their fault. After that, another doctor visited Ivan, but at this point, Ilyich has lost all the hope possible, and so he just straight up told the doctor to just leave him alone, as everyone knows that nothing could be done anymore. The doctor concluded that Ivan's physical sufferings were horrible, but the truth was that his moral sufferings were even worse. And they actually got worse after one night Ivan asked himself if maybe he had not lived his life as he should have. That maybe everything he cared for, his career, family, his professional and social ambitions, were in fact false. And so he began to go over his life once more, but this time with a completely new perspective. And it started to become clear to him that everything was in fact false, and it filled him with such a great amount of suffering that he even tore his bedclothes, thinking that they were choking him. After that, he received a large dose of opium, and it made him calm for some time, but then as he regained consciousness, he began tossing from side to side again. To this, Fedorovna, not really knowing what to do in this situation, asked Ivan to agree to receive the sacrament, and at first he was not really sure why would he do that, but then as his wife broke down crying, he agreed. Soon the priest came to their house, heard Ivan's confession, and then gave him the communion, which actually made Ivan feel better, as he even started to think about recovery again. But then as he heard Fedorovna speaking, suddenly the thought that everything was false came back to him and filled him with hatred bigger than ever before. He then quickly turned onto his back and he began yelling for everyone to go away and leave him alone. From that moment, Ivan began screaming, and he did not stop for the next 3 days. And those last days were terrible for him, as he lost all the sense of time and he just kept tossing around as if trying to fight off the approaching death. And he felt himself sinking into a black hole, and for a moment he was resisting it, but then he felt that a strange force pushed him into it. And there at the very bottom, Ivan found the truth. He realized that his whole life was in fact wrong, and it left him very confused as he was trying to figure out what was right then. He asked himself this question an hour before his death, and just as he was about to pass away, his son came into the room, grabbed his hand, and then bursted into tears. At this point, Ivan realized that there's no doubt that his whole life was in fact false, not at all what it truly should have been. And he then felt sorry for his son. Then Fedorovna came up to him and he saw her face full of tears, and he felt sorry for her as well. Ivan then came to the conclusion that he's been tormenting them and that everything will be better after he dies. But he still felt the need to do something for them, and so he asked them to leave, as this was obviously too much for them to bear. And he wanted to add "forgive me," but he was too weak to speak at this point, and so he just said "forgo me" without the strength to correct himself. And suddenly he felt lighter, thinking how good and simple was doing something to make his family feel better. And even the pain was not so scary anymore, as Ivan intentionally paid attention to it to make sure that it's still there. And after he felt it, he decided to face death, as he was no longer afraid of it. And so he looked for death, but instead of death, there was light. He then shouted in complete understanding what gladness it is to die, and the rest for him was just a matter of a moment, while for others his death lasted for 2 more hours. But then finally someone above him said, "It's the end," and Ivan heard those words, but after a while he took his last breath and then he finally died. So that was the whole story of the death of Ivan Ilyich. Did you like it? I personally did a lot, especially because before reading this novel, I thought that I have some things figured out, but I feel called out a little bit, especially given that I am at this point in my life where I'm kind of like focusing on the career stuff. I guess maybe we can make YouTube into my career. That would be so nice. You can subscribe for that. But at the same time, I'm also thinking so much about wanting to start my own family. And so I'm kind of like in between those two stages. And so when I was reading The Death of Ivan Ilyich, I kind of had some reflections about my own goals in life, because I was like, yeah, first career, then the family. Kind of seems similar to what I have going on here right now. But then I came to the conclusion that it was not what Ivan was doing with his life, but rather how he was doing it. Because it seems to me that he could still live the same life that he lived, with the same job, the same wife, the same house, and it could have been meaningful if only his attitude had been different. But now, what would be the right attitude then? Well, to find that out, let's go back to Tolstoy's confession so that we can see what the author thought about it. In his confession, Tolstoy wrote, "I remembered that I only lived at those times when I believed in God. As it was before, so it was now. I need only be aware of God to live. I need only forget him or disbelieve him, and I died." And so it seems to me that Ivan's life could have been more meaningful if, instead of keeping his mind on the pleasures of life, he had kept it on God. And to give you an example from the novel, let's look at Ivan's marriage to Fedorovna. In the beginning, everything was wonderful because marriage brought him pleasure, and pleasure was everything that he was searching for in life. But then Fedorovna got pregnant, and obviously she was not in a pretty good mood. And now, when pleasure was no longer available in the marriage, Ivan decided to step back because he was still keeping his mind on pleasure alone, and so he decided to just search for it elsewhere. But obviously, if he concentrated on God, then everything would look different. Especially considering that the Bible says, "Husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her." And so naturally, if Ivan was thinking about God and what he should do with accordance to God's will, then he would sacrifice his own pleasure in order to love his wife. And at first sight, you may think that his life would have been more difficult then, but I would argue that it would be more meaningful. Just because I subjectively feel that love will always be better than pleasure alone, even if you have to suffer a bit to get it. And so what? Am I going to leave you with the conclusion that the meaning of life is God? No. I'm going to be much worse, actually. Or I don't know, maybe you will like the idea. Because in my personal opinion, the meaning of life, and especially the meaning of Christian life, is theosis, or deification. And now, when it comes to this topic, I am an amateur. Actually, I am worse than an amateur. But I will try to kind of explain it. Or I will give you a definition that I really like. It comes from a book, from an introduction to a book called Theosis, Deification in Christian Theology. And it reads, "Deification refers to the transformation of believers into the likeness of God. Of course, Christian monotheism goes against any literal God-making of believers. Rather, the New Testament speaks of a transformation of mind, a metamorphosis of character, a redefinition of selfhood, and an imitation of God." And so, in my opinion, this really seems to be the conclusion, the best conclusion, when it comes to this whole the meaning of a Christian life thing. But as I said, I am just trying to figure this stuff out, so I'm not saying that I'm correct or on it or anything, but I just find it interesting, and I really want to kind of understand the point of Christianity, I would say, and it just seems to be the most possible explanation, to be honest. And if for some reason you would be interested in my own reasoning for theosis, then I actually kind of came up to a similar conclusion when I was filming my video on Purgatorio, so you can go check that out if you want. And I'm not saying that I did anything smart there. I feel like it's more kind of how sometimes you come up with an idea and you're like, oh, this is such a nice idea. But then you figure out that not only someone already came up with it, but they did it better. Kind of like that. The situation is kind of like that. Because in the sense that I was reading the Bible, and previously in my life, I was kind of interested in Christianity, but it was just an interest, not from the perspective of a believer. I did not really consider Christianity for myself for a very, very long period of time. And so, but then I started to be maybe there's something to it. Let me actually get into it from the perspective of someone who would want to believe. And so I started to read it. And given that I was previously also very interested in Buddhism, naturally I was paying a lot of attention to any mentions of the mind. And yeah, I just kind of came to the conclusion that it really does seem to me that the Bible talks about the transformation of your mind into the mind of Jesus. And I felt a bit insane when I was talking about this on the channel. I remember that I was like filming it, and then I was rewatching it, and I was like, maybe I should like step back a little bit and stop thinking about this, just chill and not get myself too deep into that, because but then I started to research different denominations, because I was like, okay, if I want to be Christian, then I have to know what denomination I would choose. And so I started to research those, and one of the first things that I read about when I was learning about the Eastern Orthodoxy was theosis. And when I read about theosis, it was like, yes, just yes, this is what I've been searching for. So, but I don't know, like, you know, at the same time, maybe I am just very, very influenced by Buddhism, and maybe this is why I think this way. It's very possible. So I literally have no idea, but this is just, theosis just seems very true to me. So yeah, if for some reason you would be interested in me talking about this stuff, then I have this like fragment at the end of my Purgatorio video. Or like, of course, you can watch the whole video, not just the end, but my thinking is there at the end. Because now that I know about theosis, I don't feel completely insane anymore. So now you can watch it. And I will maybe like link the video in the description or something. And also, I guess I kind of want to give you like an update on my beliefs, because for some reason I've been talking about this on the channel. So yeah, why not continue doing that? And also, I noticed that it seems to me that people who watch me are kind of interested in religions as well. It's so very nice of you. I never expected to have this kind of audience. Like, to be honest, when I started the channel, I thought that I'm just doing like silly videos with silly summaries and basically that. So the fact that I'm like talking about religions right now, this is so extremely bizarre to me, but here we are. But let me tell you, because I came to this point where I don't really see a way to move forward, and so yeah, I guess I'm going to be stuck here for the next years of my life. Okay, so let me make myself clear. I would say that I believe in Christian God because I believe that everything that Jesus said was true. Like, I really trust this man with my whole life. Everything that he was talking about, it seems to me to be true. And and he was talking a lot about God. And so because of that, I believe in God, because I believe in Jesus. I believe that he really, like, everything that he said was true. But now the problem is that I don't really know what he meant. And that's the biggest problem of it all, because I was trying to like choose a denomination, and I just figured that I am literally not able to, because I just don't have enough information to do that. Because, like, you know, it's one thing to read about what Jesus was talking about when it comes to like some moral lessons and everything like that, but then when it comes to the actual structure of the church and stuff like this, I'm not really sure. And so I am just literally unable to choose a denomination for myself. And so that's my biggest problem. And I know that there's like a non-denominational church, but for me it's not enough. Like, I really want, if I go somewhere and I commit myself somewhere, I really want to know that I'm right in my judgment, and if I were to choose a denomination right now, I would not be able to be so sure about my judgment. Do you get what I mean? And so yeah, that's kind of the thing. I believe that everything that Jesus said was true, but I don't really understand everything that he said. And so because of that, I don't know about the denomination stuff. Yeah, but at the same time, I do gravitate towards the Eastern Orthodoxy for the reason of theosis, because I really, like, currently, it just really seems to me like theosis is the answer. So yeah, so this is kind of where I stand right now. But I don't know. And like the Bible is kind of complicated, you know? It really is. And it's not that easy to know the truth about the Bible. So yeah, I don't really know what to do with that. I'm probably still going to like search for the answer to that, but to be honest, I don't think that I can find the answer. I think that I kind of got myself into this point where I'm just slowly starting to accept that I'm never going to have the answer that I want to have. And so yeah, this is kind of where I stand right now. As I said, I don't really see a way out of this position, so it's probably going to be like this for the next couple of years. And yeah, thank you so much for watching. Especially that you're watching till the end. Very nice of you. You can subscribe to the channel, you can like the video, you can even leave a comment if you want, and bye bye!